Thank you, Christy. Well, it's so fun that I get to be with you 2 weeks in a row. What a gift. And also, what a gift that we have Mary and Martha back to back, right? So we, as just kind of as a grander scope, we're studying this study, Be Still and Know. And isn't it about the God of seasons, right? The God of seasons, the God who is consistent in our scurry, the God who is consistent in our sorrow and our pain, the God who is consistent in our joy. So as we reflect on God settings, I do actually, that's some of the pictures that I provided for you, which I think, I know I'm just barely a millennial, but I still struggle sometimes on Zoom. So I'm going to try and screen share with you so you can see bigger versions of the pictures that I provided for you in your handout. But for me, gosh, fall just feels magical. And we have the street that I live on. When we first were looking at homes, we had 3 different homes that we were looking at all around. We had one in Shorewood we were looking at, we had one in Wilsonville, and then one in Westland. We ended up choosing Westland partly because we looked in October and our street was a canopy of red leaves, and there was just a carpet of red when we drove down the street, and it just felt magical. And so we just thought, oh my goodness, this is just spectacular. And coming from California, where there really is, like, I remember the one tree that I would, on my 15-minute drive to work, there was one tree that changed colors. And I would always stop and be like, oh, it's so beautiful. But our street, okay, so here we go. We're going to give this a try with screen sharing just so you can see a little bit bigger. Oh, hang on. I thought I had it all set up, but maybe I don't. Share. And no, file. Okay, wait for it. Anybody have any genius? How do I do this? I haven't actually shared screen.
What is it you're trying to share?
I have a file of the pictures in bigger form.
So you're not going to share the file necessarily. You're going to share your screen. So open up the file so you can see it on your screen.
Got it. Bless you. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Did it work? Let's share screen. You got it?
Yes.
Can you see my screen? Okay. So this is what our street looked like when we went house hunting. So it's a canopy of just these beautiful oranges and reds, and the street is starting to be covered. So this was taken almost exactly 1 year ago today. And as I reflected on our reading, the best image that came to mind, so we have this reading of the story of Lazarus and the death of Lazarus, and how this miracle of Jesus raising him from the dead, that picture of death and life. The first image that came to my mind was last winter during the ice storm. So now your second picture that you guys were provided was this one. Can you see it? Is it on your screens now? So that's our neighborhood last winter during the ice storm. So here we have this beautiful strip of trees, and during that ice storm, every single one of the trees on our street was declared dead. It was 3 days of just popping, as we all lived through it, popping, snapping, trees breaking, death. I mean, really, it was this season of death where we just, there was an element of fear, but then there was also just this feeling of, oh my goodness, I was surprised by my grief over trees. I thought, this is so ridiculous. Why am I so sad? And then as we moved into the season of Lent, and all of this will come together as we climb into our passage for today, all of our trees, the city came through and cut them all down to stumps. So I'll show you that picture of the stump. Here we go. So I was on a walk one day with my neighbor who currently is battling with lymphoma, and she had just come back from a really long stay at the hospital, and so she was practicing just walking the loop in our neighborhood. And we were talking about life, and she's got two 13-year-old girls, and just the struggle of having to walk the journey of grief with these girls. And here we are walking our neighborhood that has been this gift of joy for our whole block. Everybody just loves the trees, and then the devastation and the destruction, the death, and then all of these stumps, and we're just walking stump to stump to stump. And we both looked down in the middle of our walk, and we saw this image. And there were these beautiful little blooms that were popping out. And we both stopped and looked at each other, and we just were stunned to silence for a moment. We thought, gosh, if this isn't an image of the grander story of life, I don't know what is. So we have these seasons where death and destruction and pain and suffering and grief happen. But this is the promise. This is the promise that we get to hold on to when we go through these storms of sadness, that life always follows death. So now I would love for us, I'm gonna see if I can figure out how to close this down. I would love for someone, would anybody be willing to read the passage for us? It's a long one, so if you just want to take a chunk of it and then popcorn to someone. I don't know if you're familiar with the popcorn reading. Let me stop my screen sharing. Thank you for putting up with my inabilities to not know how to screen share. Okay, how do I turn it off now?
There should be in your Zoom toolbar, I think there's something that says stop screen share or stop share.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay, there we are. Thank you. All right, I know, this is so sad. I am technically a millennial, and I still am learning all of the details. Would someone be willing to read John 11, 1 through 40, the story of life coming from death for us?
I'd be happy to, Kelly. Diana?
Thank you. Thank you, Diana.
I'd also be happy to share if someone wants to pick it up at Jesus Weeps on the second page, just for someone else have the desire. Yes? No? Okay.
If you want to stop at that point, I'd be happy to pick it up from you at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
John 11, verses 1 through 40. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you are going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them. After saying this, he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right. Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary, and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here so that they may believe you sent me. When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go.
Thank you, Diana. What an amazing reading voice, and just thank you. What a gift that was that you just gave to us. Thank you so much. Long passage. Would love to hear, before we dive into content and context, what stood out to you? Was there a word or a phrase or an image that resonated with you from this passage?
The words greatly disturbed really jumped out. I think it's a reminder of how deeply things can be felt and how deeply Jesus feels as well.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Thank
you. Jesus wept. It just hearing that, it makes me sad. It reminds me of all the losses that we've had, and how easily the tears just seem to want to flow out.
Yeah, and how beautiful that we have a Jesus who understands and feels what we feel, right? Yeah.
Both Mary and, are you hearing me?
Yep.
Oh, both Mary and Martha, in their face, said, if you had been here, just his presence, if he had just been there, then his Lazarus would not have died. I don't know what they thought he would do or anything, but both of them said, if you had just been here, that was, for me, was their proof of their faith in him and his abilities, and he wouldn't have had to do anything other than just be there.
Yeah, such a great insight. That it's proof of their faith. I read it as, I'm so grateful they're just able to be honest with Jesus, but I love that you read it as they're faithful. You know, can be kind of seen from both angles. So, right. Thank you, Rita. Anything else?
Well, Jesus talks about that this is for the glory of God. There are a few times he talks about glorified or the glory of God. So he's kind of preparing, I think, all of us to know that we are very sad, we are disturbed, but we know that in the end, God is glorified and we will all be risen. And I think that theme just goes through it so much to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it said he waited 2 days, deliberately waited. And sometimes we don't understand why there's waiting. We get impatient.
Amen. Why? Why did you wait? Some things just don't make sense to us, huh? Yeah.
And yet there's
Anything
indication
else?
of why he waited. The repetition of that phrase, that you might come to believe, that you might come to put your trust in me. So I think that's key.
Mm-hmm. And yet it almost feels like it does the opposite when we're in the thick of it. What is happening? You're making me doubt. Anything else? Anything else stand out?
I've always been curious when Jesus said, this illness is not, how did they state it here?
Intended for death or something like that.
This
illness does not lead to death.
This is not a deadly illness. And I thought, okay, so what is that? Is that just dying from old age? But anyway, that hit me, because what kind of illness would it be that this one doesn't lead to death?
Good question, Rita. I think we may touch on that a little bit. Well, I want to give, as I always love to do, probably more just because I love it, just for my own study purposes, but just a little bit of overarching context first before we dive into this specific passage, that might also help us understand some of the key points. And Rita, you just hit on a big one too. So the overarching theme of the book of John, the Gospel of John, is that Jesus is the Messiah. So every story and illustration is pointing to Jesus being the Messiah, the one who is the resurrection and the life, the one who is the promised one we've been waiting for. So keeping that in mind, if we can keep that in the forefront of our minds as we read all of these pieces, John is continually trying to point us toward that belief and understanding that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the promises of the Messiah. Another thing to pay attention to, or just to note, is that the number 7 is a really key number in this passage. I think it's just a fun thing to note, but it's also just an interesting piece. And why I think it's interesting is 7 is the number for completion. So Jesus is the complete promise, the complete one, the one that we've been waiting for. So in the book of John alone, there's 7 names given to Jesus, 7 signs or miracles, 7 feasts, 7 discourses or I am statements. So we have, the names that are given for Jesus in 1:19 through 51 are Lamb of God, Son of God, Rabbi, Messiah, Son of Joseph from Nazareth, King of Israel, Son of Man. So there's 7 names. The signs and miracles, chapters 2 through 10. So right before this, we have 6 of the signs. And then the 7th one is this one, which is the culmination of all of the signs pointing to Jesus as the resurrection and the life, the one that we've been waiting for, the Messiah, the promised one. So this last miracle is really kind of the crescendo of all of the signs that help us to see, and then therefore, as Robin was pointing out, to believe that he is the fulfillment, the one we've been waiting for. The 7 I am statements, those discourses where Jesus declares, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life, which he says in this particular one. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I am the true vine. These are, again, 7. It's this repetition that's kind of embedded in the book of John, that Jesus is the complete, the one we've been waiting for. And so the other theme to pay attention to in this book, as Jesus is the Messiah, is that image of love. That love is consistently in the book of John also linked to death. We can see that in John 3:16, which probably, if we've been around the church long enough, we know that passage. And then John 15:13. So there's just kind of this repetition of love linked to death, that the fulfillment of this Messiah, the one who loves us, is willing to lay down his life for us. So in chapter 10, and why this is important and where this is expanded on, is just before our passage this morning. In chapter 10, there's an attempt to stone Jesus. And so he leaves Jerusalem. He's at this feast, and he leaves Jerusalem to get away from those who are trying to kill him. Now, Lazarus lives 2 miles from Jerusalem. So by returning to where Lazarus lives, he knows that he is beginning his own journey toward death. That's really significant. So it's not just like, he's just traveling and then he makes another stop and, he raises Lazarus from the dead. This is the beginning of his own journey toward his own death, the ultimate act of love, the ultimate symbol of Jesus as Messiah. So love is linked to death in every act, especially in this particular. This is the first movement of Jesus toward Jerusalem for his own death. The other thing that is really, that I just love about this particular passage is that it is linked to, we have it embedded in our lectionary reading. So our lectionary is that 3-year cycle of reading through scripture, and we get through quite a bit of it, but it's in the Lenten season. So why, you're going to have a chance in your small groups to explore why that might be significant. Why would this reading, and I would love to just hear maybe some initial thoughts, why is this reading particularly relevant for Lent? And this is where I would love to just get some initial feedback. What is Lent all about?
Resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it is partnered, as we read this, in that it's in the first lectionary year, it's partnered with the Ezekiel 37 passage of the Valley of Dry Bones. So how beautiful to kind of read it in the mindset, the context of Jesus being the one that we wait for in Lent. Lent is that season of waiting for the promise of resurrection, and the promise that it is not as it's supposed to be right now. All is not as it is supposed to be. These dry bones, they will rise again. This body, this Lazarus, who we all assume is dead, this isn't the end of Lazarus' story. This is just the beginning, the fulfillment, that last sign that Jesus is the Messiah. So, what kind of going back to the images that I showed you at the beginning of our time together, that final image was taken a week or 2 before Easter, because as we know in our own season, our own leaves falling, that beginning season of death, and then when the trees are bare and everything just kind of feels dormant and dead and brown, and then spring comes. I believe that God, in so many ways, has given us the gift of these images in our everyday lives of the reality that is beating and the drum that is beating underneath our lives, that life will always follow death. So we witness the falling of the leaves, and we witness things dying, and we witness trees being cut down. But what is the final word, that life rises from death, beauty comes from ashes. And that's what this story is about. It is the story that we were made for. So it's essential that we climb into the reality that we understand that we have been made for life. And so when Jesus says in this, I am the resurrection and the life, this is the story you were written for. This is the story that your life is made for. That death doesn't have the final sting. Death doesn't get the last word. So going into our passage for today, verse 1, I just love kind of going verse by verse, and this is too long, so we won't go to every single verse, but just a few little tidbits along the way. So one piece that I thought was interesting, Bethany has, the word Bethany has a couple different translations, but it is one of the translations or definitions of Bethany is house of affliction. Now, what is so interesting is that Mary and Martha and Lazarus live in this house of affliction, and it is in Bethany, this house of affliction, that God's glory is revealed. If that doesn't have lasting life lessons, I don't know what does. Sometimes in our affliction, God's glory is revealed because God is in the business of bringing beauty from ashes. So I love just that, even that little detail, the house of affliction is where God's presence is experienced so profoundly. It is in affliction that glory is revealed. And gosh, I experienced that on my own street in my own neighborhood, that even in the midst of the death and affliction of these silly trees that I couldn't believe I was sad about, we got to experience the glory, that lasting promise that life still will rise. Also in verse 1, we see Mary and Martha are mentioned, but what's important to note here is that this is the first time that in the Gospel of John that they make an appearance. So we have the mindset because we were with them last week, but we were with them in the book of Luke. And so this is the first time that they have made an appearance. But what's so interesting is that, John talks about them as though we all know them. So probably for the community that was originally hearing this story, they knew Mary and Martha. They were a well-known entity in that community. But for our purposes, this is their first appearance, which is also interesting when you see the next line, that Mary is the one who wiped Jesus' feet with her hair and her tears. That doesn't come until chapter 12, verse 3. So it's almost a foreshadowing. We have this little, of course, Mary is the one who wiped Jesus' feet with her hair, but we haven't seen that happen yet. That's going to happen in a little bit. So another thing that's also just a key little nugget is this isn't the same person in Luke 7:36 who anointed Jesus with oil from the alabaster jar. It's believed that these are two different, separate scenarios. So somebody asked me that once, and I just wanted to add that clarifying detail. So verse 3, I love this little detail. And I think as we read through this story, pay attention to what stands out to you about Jesus. Pay attention to his heart in this. That detail in verse 3 that says, he whom you love is ill. There are 4 people in the book of John who are described as he whom you love. Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and the writer of this book. If you know, John is always referring to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. What would it be like to have that nickname? The nickname of loved one. I love the power of that. Do you have a nickname? Have you ever had a nickname? And has there been one that has been especially powerful? This is a pretty great nickname. The one whom Jesus loved. Pretty great to be referred to as that, but it's just also interesting that they are the only ones in John's gospel that have that name. So verse 4, we're just kind of slowly moving through verse 4, through this passage, but then I will speed it up in a minute. I think it was, who was it that mentioned? I think it was Rita that mentioned this illness does not lead to death. What do we think that means? I'd love to hear your thoughts on why Jesus said that. Now that we've gotten a little bit of background to the gospel, what do you think Jesus meant when he said that?
Death won't have the last word. There's redemption.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Lazarus will rise. He knew Lazarus believed, and that this would not be death, that he would rise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is Jesus pointing to himself as the resurrection and the life. Remember who I am. They didn't fully understand yet, did they? So this saying that feels so mysterious. What do you mean? Like every illness eventually, we're kind of, there's one thing that's certain, we all will die. But Jesus is making it very clear that that is not the final word. And so when he says this illness will not lead to death, it's yet a glimpse again that he is, remember that theme in John, that he's the true Messiah, the fulfillment, the number 7, the complete package, the one that we've been waiting for. So this illness does not lead to death because no illness leads to death. For my people, those who believe in me, no illness leads to death. I am the resurrection and the life. So though the body may die, you will not ever. This is not the final word. Resurrection is the final word. Life is the final word. Life because of me. What, as you look at verses 7 through 14, and gosh, I wish we had like 3 verses we could talk about, but there's 44 in this. So I'm quickly clipping through this, knowing that I do need to let you go to your small group time in a few minutes. But verse 7 through 14, what are some repeat phrases that you see in here?
Definitely the life, death phrases are really prominent. You kind of highlighted light and dark. I guess I didn't notice that right away, but there is that light, dark theme.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Awake, asleep.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good visual as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, sorry. Sometimes when I'm going through passages, I bold them. So not to create a cheat sheet, but I like to bold them for my own studying purposes. Carry on. What were you going to say, Christy? Sorry. I think I cut you off.
No, you didn't. And actually, it helps us as well. So thanks. Thanks for your boldness.
No problem. It's one of my, and then sometimes I just don't undo it when I send out the thing. But yeah, so those repeat, kind of going back to, gosh, I wish we could do a whole study on the book of John because it's just so beautiful and powerful. But you look at the very beginning of John and Jesus says, Robin, yeah, all for that idea, huh?
Jesus is the one that comes up with isn't there 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not with them. And after saying this, he says, our friend has fallen asleep and I am there to awaken him. And they know about death and he's talking about sleep, but he's dead, but he's talking about awakening. It's like, which part of the wet slap on the side of the face? Are you listening to me? Are you paying attention? Hello.
I mean, but isn't that just how Jesus is? Look at the whole story of scripture. We need 100 reminders. And the beginning of John, Jesus is described in those same words. There's that light and dark, where I want to go back and study all of John, but we don't have time. So Jesus is described as the light. And so over and over and over and over again in this passage, We keep being pointed to the one who gives life, who causes life to rise out of death. So if we start just at the very base level as we study scripture, just paying attention to the repetition of certain words that we see embedded throughout, whether it's a chapter, a verse, or even an entire book. But in this book, light and dark, life and death, those are very repeated phrases in the Gospel of John. So we pay attention to those because it points us to the one who is light in the darkness, who is life when death comes, who is with us in the midst of all of it. So pay attention to those repeat phrases. And then we get into that verse 25, the I am saying. So it's almost like this whole lead up, all these verses leading up to this. And, verse 4, the illness doesn't lead to death. Verse 7 through 14, this, all of these awake, asleep, light, dark, life, death, all of that language is pointing to this last I am saying, that number 7 I am saying. The climax, now there will be a couple more coming, but that is what people would define as kind of the crescendo I am saying. I am the resurrection and the life. And then we my goodness, I know that we need to get to your small groups, but verse 32, I'm just going to hit a couple more key verses and then we'll wrap it up. Verse 32, have you noticed Mary's posture? What was Mary's posture last week? Chris, you said something, but I think you're muted. Oh, go ahead.
She was at his feet last week as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
She's pretty smart.
Yes. And if we were to jump ahead to when she anoints Jesus' feet, where is she again? At Jesus' feet. So we get to see the invitation here. What's the invitation for us in all of this? It is to return to Jesus' feet, the one who is the resurrection and the life, the one who will give hope when all seems hopeless, when we feel like, where were you? We return to Jesus' feet and sit in Jesus' presence. So funny, I keep looking at all of your faces, but I realize I'm not actually looking at the camera, so I'm sorry. If you feel like I'm looking away, it's because I'm trying to stare into each of your eyes, because this is important. That posture is our invitation. The posture of falling to Jesus' feet and being with Jesus and allowing Jesus to be with us in our grief. And these last two little sections from this passage that I want to highlight teach us a little bit about the heart of Jesus. He was greatly disturbed. I think Christy mentioned that stood out to her. He was greatly disturbed. Gosh, Jesus understands us. Jesus is with us. Jesus feels what we feel and has felt what we feel. He is no stranger to our pain. I think one of the things that is so beautiful about this passage, that the God of the universe, who is the resurrection and the life, felt greatly disturbed and was grieved himself. Have you ever been in the midst of your own grief and had someone come alongside of you and weep with you? I once had a friend back in seminary. I was going through something emotional. I'm a crier anyway. Sorry, Robin. She's witnessed me cry way too many times. But I had a friend who sat with me in that, and I was crying and really emotional, and she just started crying with me. And it had nothing to do with her, but she just had such she was so empathetic that it just was, I will never forget that. And I didn't even know her that well. We just had gone to dinner and we were processing something before going to class together. And she just wept with me. That is a teeny tiny fraction of the Jesus that loves us and weeps with us when we are going through our own grief. I love that about Jesus. I love that they said that twice in this passage, that he was greatly disturbed. That repetition, again, when there's something that is noted more than once, it's important to pay attention to because it's something they're trying to highlight. So the gift of Jesus in this is that he gets it. He's with us. He doesn't shame us for feeling our grief. but just cries with us. And the last little thing I'll point out just that I loved was that phrase, unbind him and let him go. Now, just read by itself, it's kind of okay. But when we read it in light of Jesus being the resurrection and the life, I think of that passage in Hebrews 12, 1-3, that says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles and run the race set out for us. So when Jesus says, unbind him, it's like this Jesus, the resurrection and the life, we're made to be unbound, to throw off all the things that are entangling us and to run and to live this life freely and lightly because we know the resurrection and the life. So that, that physical wrap on Lazarus is also a metaphorical figure for get rid of it. Get rid of the stuff that is keeping you bogged down, that is locking you up, and be free and live lightly with the Jesus who loves you and is with you. There's just way too much to touch on this. So I am going to send you into your small group time so you actually have a little bit of time to talk. But as you go into your group time, I would love for you to think about, I put a quote in here at the very beginning and then inside your questions that says, our days are lived in the meantime on the path straining forward within a world rich with spiritual metaphor. So I put that in there because I believe that there are symbols throughout our lives, not just in nature, but all throughout life, that reflect life coming after death, that life always follows death, because I believe that's the way that Jesus has written our story. So I would love for you to kind of think about what metaphors, maybe it is the trees fall, the leaves falling in fall, and then the promise of the spring flowers. I would love for you to just kind of mull on what spiritual metaphors have shown you the story that we are made for, the story that life always follows death, the story that we are not to despair, that death doesn't have the last word. If there are other, it's so helpful for us to shine light on the places where God is showing up and helping us to learn. So if you have images that come to mind, just know that will be one thing that will be fun to discuss in your small group time. But I'm sorry this passage is so long and I couldn't even barely scrape the surface with it, but I want to close with just the promise that in our storms of sadness, we have a Jesus who weeps with us and who is the author of life and resurrection. And that never gets the last word. Death does not get the last word. Life and resurrection gets the last word because he is the complete, the Messiah, the one we've been waiting for. So enjoy your small group time, and sorry for the fire hose.